They said Elspeth Kincaid was digging a grave for herself and her 15-year-old brother, and in a way, they were right about the dimensions. It was 6 feet deep, narrow at the entrance, and dark enough to swallow a body whole. But they were wrong about who would be lying in the frozen earth by the end of that winter. The year was 1895, and the autumn wind was already carrying promises of death across the Quarry Ridge Valley in Montana. Elsie, as everyone called her, stood at the mouth of the hole she had carved into the limestone hillside, her hands wrapped in strips of flour sacking to keep the blisters from weeping. She was 18 years old. She had no parents. She had no husband. She had 40 acres of rocky scrubland that no plow could break, and a younger brother who still woke up crying in the night, calling out for a father who would never answer. Behind her, sitting in the brown grass with his chin resting on his paws, a collie dog watched every swing of her pickaxe. His name was Bramble, and his coat was the color of autumn leaves mixed with fresh cream. He had been a gift from their father, brought home as a squirming puppy just 3 months before the mine collapsed. Now Bramble was 3 years old, and he never let Elsie out of his sight. He seemed to understand, in the way that dogs understand things humans cannot explain, that she was all he had left. Tobias sat on a flat rock nearby, mending a tear in his only pair of work trousers. At 15, he was tall for his age, but thin in a way that spoke of missed meals and growing bones that never quite got enough. His hands moved the needle with practiced efficiency. Their mother had taught him to sew before the flood took her. Their father had taught him to never waste anything before the mountain took him. Toby looked up at his sister, watching the pickaxe rise and fall in a rhythm that had become as familiar as a heartbeat over these past weeks. She had not stopped, not when the general store owner told her she was crazy, not when the ranchers laughed at her in the street, not when the deputy marshal came out to warn her that if the tunnel collapsed, no one was obligated to dig out her body. She just kept swinging. The limestone gave way in chunks and dust, and Elsie loaded each piece into the wheelbarrow with the wobbly left wheel. The bruises on her shoulders had turned from purple to green to yellow and back to purple again. The calluses on her palms had split and healed and split again. But every night when she crawled out of that hole and stood in the cooling air, she could feel something building, something that felt like safety. She remembered her father's voice, soft and rough like gravel wrapped in velvet, speaking to her by candlelight in the cabin that the bank had since taken away. The earth holds its warmth, Elsie girl. 50 degrees year-round if you go deep enough. The wind is what kills, not the ground. The ground wants to keep you alive. Caleb Kincaid had been a miner from Cornwall, that rocky finger of land pointing out into the Atlantic from the southwestern tip of England. He had spent his childhood crawling through tunnels carved into cliffs that had stood for 10,000 years. He knew stone the way other men knew horses or crops. He knew how it breathed, how it held heat, how it could protect you if you understood its nature. He had come to America in 1880, chasing copper and silver and the promise of enough money to buy land of his own. He had found work in the mines outside Helena, married a woman named Rosemary who laughed like church bells, and built a cabin on 40 acres that everyone said was worthless. The land was too rocky to farm, too steep for cattle, too far from town to be convenient. But Caleb saw what others missed. He saw the limestone ridge that ran along the northern edge, porous enough to drain water, but solid enough to carve. He saw the southern exposure that would catch winter sun. He saw shelter. He never got to build what he saw. In 1890, when Elsie was 13 and Toby was 10, the spring rains came harder than anyone could remember. The creek that ran through the valley swelled into a monster. Rosemary had gone to check on the neighbor's wife, who was due to deliver her first child. She was crossing the footbridge when the water took it. They found her body 2 miles downstream, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood tree. She was still holding the bundle of clean linens she had been bringing for the birth. Caleb never quite recovered. He still went to work in the mines. He still came home and cooked dinner for his children. He still told Elsie stories about Cornwall, about the tin miners who carved chapels into cliff faces, about the fishing villages where houses were built half into the hillside to shelter from the Atlantic gales. But something behind his eyes had gone dark, like a lantern with the wick turned down too low. 4 years later, in the autumn of 1894, A support beam in Tunnel 7 gave way. 3 men were killed instantly. Caleb was one of them. The mining company sent a man with a leather satchel in a document that said they owed the Kincaid estate $47 in back wages. The bank sent a different man who explained that the mortgage on the cabin was past due and that the children would need to vacate within 30 days. They let Elsie and Toby keep the 40 acres. No one else wanted them. For that first winter, they survived in a lean-to made of salvaged lumber and canvas. Elsie worked any job she could find, washing dishes, mending clothes, cleaning stables. Toby trapped rabbits and collected firewood. Bramble kept their feet warm at night. They survived, but barely. When spring came, Elsie made a decision. She would not spend another winter shivering under canvas, praying that the wind would not find the gaps in their shelter. She would not watch her brother's lips turn blue while they rationed firewood that seemed to vanish faster than they could gather it. She would build what her father never had the chance to build. She would dig into the hill. The town of Elkhorn Creek, 4 miles to the south, had opinions about this decision. Towns always have opinions about young women who refuse to behave in expected ways, and Elspeth Kincaid was behaving in a way that no one expected. She came into Edwin Bancroft's general store one afternoon in late August, her dress stained with limestone dust, her hair escaping from its braid in wild coils around her face. She counted out coins for a pound of nails, her fingers leaving pale smudges on the dark wood of the counter. Edwin was a thin man with a thin mustache and a thick sense of his own importance. He ran the only general store in Elkhorn Creek, which meant he knew everything that happened in the valley, usually before it finished happening. He looked at Elsie's dust-covered dress. He looked at the scrapes on her knuckles. He looked at the steel in her eyes that had not been there a year ago. "Heard you are digging some kind of cellar up on that ridge," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man offering advice that was really judgment. "Ground freezes 4 feet down, girl. You will suffocate in that hole." Her eyes stayed fixed on the coins she was counting. "The ground stays 50 degrees if you go deep enough," she said. "It is the wind that kills, Mr. Bancroft, not the earth." She gathered her nails into her satchel and walked out before he could respond. Behind her, she heard him click his tongue against his teeth, a wet sound of disapproval. The gossip spread through Elkhorn Creek the way all gossip spreads through small towns, quickly and with embellishment. The Kincaid girl was digging a burrow like a badger. The Kincaid girl had lost her mind from grief. The Kincaid girl was practicing some kind of heathen ritual from the old country. Elsie heard the whispers. The whispers washed over her like wind over stone. Her father had taught her that silence was its own kind of answer, the kind that drove gossips mad because it gave them nothing to grab onto. She just kept digging. By the end of September, the tunnel was 12 feet deep. The walls were smooth where she had packed the clay with the flat of her spade. The ceiling was shored with cedar posts she had dragged from the creek bed, one at a time, her shoulders screaming with each step. She had no horse. She had no money to hire help. She had a wheelbarrow with a wobbling wheel and a determination that had crystallized into something harder than the limestone she was carving. Toby helped when he could, hauling rubble and mixing mortar from creek sand and lime. But he was smaller than his sister, and the work was brutal. Most days, she sent him into town to do odd jobs, earning pennies that she saved in a tobacco tin under her cot. One evening, as the sun was painting the ridge in shades of copper and gold, a wagon came up the rutted track from town. Elsie set down her pickaxe and wiped the sweat from her forehead, watching the approaching dust cloud with narrowed eyes. The wagon was expensive, black lacquered wood with brass fittings that caught the fading light. The horses were matched bays, well-fed and well-groomed. The man driving them wore a Stetson hat that probably cost more than everything Elsie owned combined. Garrett Holloway. He was the largest rancher in the Quarry Ridge Valley, owner of 500 head of cattle and 1,200 acres of prime grazing land. He was 52 years old with a silver-streaked beard and eyes the color of flint. He had come to Montana 30 years ago with nothing but a saddle and a bad attitude, and he had built an empire through a combination of hard work, harder bargaining, and a complete unwillingness to admit he could ever be wrong about anything. He pulled his wagon to a stop at the edge of Elsie's property and sat there for a long moment, looking at the hole in the hillside, at the pile of rubble, at the young woman standing beside it with a pickaxe in her blistered hands. Then he laughed. It was a dry sound, like boots crunching on gravel, and it carried across the evening air with the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted. "Building yourself a grave before you are even dead," he called out. "That is what I call planning ahead." Elsie leaned on her pickaxe and watched him, her face as readable as the limestone behind her. Garrett climbed down from his wagon, his expensive boots raising small puffs of dust. He walked toward her, thumbs hooked in his belt, examining her work with the exaggerated interest of a man inspecting something he already knew was worthless. "I will give you $2 an acre for this land," he said. $80 total, enough for you and that brother of yours to buy train tickets back east. Find some relatives. Get a job in a factory. Live like civilized people instead of burrowing in the dirt like animals." Elsie's grip tightened on the pickaxe handle. "This land has limestone," she said quietly. "Limestone does not hold water. It drains. I am not selling." Garrett's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes shifted. "You think you know something the rest of us do not," he said, "because your daddy was a miner, because he filled your head with stories about caves and tunnels. But this is cattle country, girl. This is not Cornwall." He pronounced it Cornwall, two hard syllables, making the word sound foolish. Elsie met his gaze without blinking. "My father knew stone," she said, "and he knew winters. He survived things that would have killed every man in this valley." Garrett stepped closer. His shadow fell across her face. "The winter will teach you," he said, his voice soft and cold. "It teaches everyone eventually. And when the first big drift covers that door of yours, when you are trapped in there with no food and no wood and no hope, do not expect me to dig you out." "I will not," Elsie said. Garrett stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his wagon, shaking his head. He clicked to his horses and drove away without looking back. Bramble, who had been watching from his spot by the tunnel entrance, let out a low growl as the wagon disappeared down the track. Elsie knelt beside him and scratched behind his ears. "I know, boy," she murmured. "I do not like him either." The tunnel grew deeper through October, 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, 7 feet high at the center, curving down to meet the walls in a gentle arch that distributed the weight of the earth above. Elsie had learned this from her father, who had learned it from generations of Cornish miners. A flat ceiling fights the pressure of the ground. A curved ceiling embraces it. She cut a ventilation shaft through the top of the hill, lining it with tin from salvaged buckets. She built a heavy door from the oak planks of their father's old cabin, the one the bank had taken. The wood was sound and strong, and when she hung it in the frame she had constructed, it fit so perfectly that not a whisper of wind could find its way through. She smoothed the walls until they were like fired pottery, tight and dry. She dug a shallow trench along the floor to channel any water that might seep through. She built wooden platforms to keep their bedding off the ground. And then, in late October, she walked the 4 miles to the livestock auction. The auction yard was crowded with cattlemen, big men in heavy coats who smelled of tobacco and leather and self-importance. They sat on fence rails discussing the price of beef, arguing about grazing rights, making deals with handshakes and knowing glances. They looked at Elsie's dust-stained dress and her work-roughened hands as if she were a bad omen. Some of them whispered behind their palms. "The Kincaid girl, the crazy one, the one who is digging a grave in the side of a hill." Elsie ignored them. She waited. The prime stock went first, fat cattle with glossy coats, horses with strong legs and clear eyes. Breeding bulls that sold for more money than Elsie had seen in her entire life. She waited through all of it, standing at the back of the crowd, her hands folded in front of her. Finally, near the end of the day, the undesirable stock was brought out. The animals that did not yield enough meat to be worth the feed. The ones that were too small, too old, too stubborn for the big ranches to bother with. Goats, 12 of them. They were a mixed lot, shaggy and loud, with strange horizontal pupils that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. They bleated and fought the rope, a chaotic tangle of dirty fur and clattering hooves. The auctioneer looked embarrassed to even be selling them. "150 apiece," he called out, his voice lacking the enthusiasm he had shown for the cattle. "Anyone? Anyone at all?" Silence. $1 apiece, going once. Elsie raised her hand. Every head in the auction yard turned to look at her. She felt their eyes like physical weight, pressing against her skin. She kept her hand raised. Sold, the auctioneer said, sounding relieved to be done with it. 12 goats to the young lady in the back. As Elsie stepped forward to claim her purchase, a voice rang out across the yard. What in God's name are you planning to do with those scavengers? It was Garrett Holloway, leaning against the fence with a tobacco pipe clenched between his teeth. He had been watching the whole auction, though Elsie had not noticed him until now. The other men fell silent, watching the exchange like spectators at a boxing match. You cannot drive them to market, Garrett continued, pushing himself off the fence and walking toward her. And you surely cannot eat 12 of them before the snow flies. Elsie took the lead rope of a large black nanny goat. The animal had intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor, and Elsie felt an immediate kinship with her. She would name her Midnight. They are not for eating, Elsie said, and they are not for market. Then what? Garrett laughed, that dry gravel sound. Pets? You going to keep them in that cellar of yours? Elsie looked him dead in the eye. Her voice was quiet enough that the other men had to lean in to hear. They are 50 pounds of heat apiece, Mr. Holloway. 12 goats make 600 pounds of living radiator. They eat scrub brush and pine needles, things your cattle will not touch. They give milk in January, and they do not freeze standing up. Garrett's smile faltered. He had not expected an answer. He certainly had not expected that answer. Cattle do not freeze if you have a proper barn, he said, recovering. He spat tobacco juice into the dust near her boot. But you go ahead. Play house in the dirt. When the first big drift covers that door, do not expect us to dig you out. I know, Elsie said simply. She turned and led the goats away without another word. It took her 3 hours to walk them back to the ridge, the animals bleeding and fighting the rope, a chaotic parade of shaggy fur and clattering hooves. Her arms ached from the constant tension. Bramble trotted alongside, occasionally nipping at the heels of goats that tried to stray. Toby was waiting at the entrance to the tunnel, his eyes wide. Goats? He said. Elsie, why goats? She handed him Midnight's rope. Help me get them inside. They spent the rest of the evening settling the animals into the shelter. The smell was strong, musk and hay and animal breath. But as Elsie sat in the corner on her cot, watching the thermometer she had hung on a support beam, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Outside, the first frost was settling on the pumpkin vines, the temperature dropping toward freezing. Inside, with the door barred and 12 goats chewing their cud, the mercury climbed. 55 degrees. She blew out the lantern and listened to the rhythmic breathing of the herd. Beside her, Bramble curled into a warm ball against her feet. Somewhere in the darkness, Toby was already asleep, his breathing slow and even for the first time in months. The sound felt more like company than anything Elsie had known since her father died. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Elsie has 40 acres of land that nobody wanted, a 15-year-old brother, 12 goats that the whole town laughed at, and a hole in a hillside that everyone calls a grave. Is she crazy, or does she know something that all those proud cattlemen missed? I would love to hear what you think. Leave a comment and let me know. November arrived not with snow, but with a gray stillness that seemed to drain the color out of the world. The sky turned the shade of a bruised plum, hanging low and heavy over the valley like a lid being slowly pressed down on a pot. Elsie did not trust the silence. She had learned, watching her father prepare for winters in Cornwall, that the quiet times were when you worked hardest. The storms would come. They always came. The only question was whether you would be ready. She spent her days stockpiling. She cut willow branches by the armload and bundled dried grass, stacking them floor to ceiling against the back wall of the burrow. The goats watched her with their strange horizontal eyes, occasionally nibbling at her sleeves as she worked. They had settled into the rhythm of underground life with surprising ease, going out to graze on the sparse hillside during the warmest hours, and filing back in at dusk without being told, drawn by the residual warmth of the earth. Toby had taken to naming them. Besides Midnight, there was Dusty, a pale gray doe with a crooked ear. There was Brambleberry, named in honor of the dog, a small brown goat who followed Bramble everywhere, and seemed to believe she was also a collie. There was Old Solomon, the only buck in the group, a dignified animal with a long beard and a philosophical expression. The names made them feel less like livestock and more like family. Elsie was not sure if that was a good thing or not. In town, the mood was different. The general store was bustling with men buying extra coal and thick wool blankets. There was an arrogance to their preparations, a confidence born of years of surviving winters that they believed they understood. They were fortifying their wooden boxes, trusting in pot-belly stoves and single-pane glass, certain that the same methods that had worked before would work again. Elsie went to Bancroft's store one last time, purchasing salt, lamp oil, and a 50-pound sack of oats. The air inside was hot and stuffy, the iron stove in the corner roaring with a heat that made her skin prickle. Edwin Bancroft wrapped her purchases in brown paper, his thin fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Forecast says a couple feet," he remarked. "Maybe 3. You got a shovel down there in that hole?" "I have a shovel," Elsie said. "Garrett Holloway says he has got 50 head of cattle in the north pasture he is not even bringing in." Edwin leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to the confidential tone of a man sharing important gossip. "Says their coats are thick enough. Says bringing them in just makes them soft." "Garrett is wrong," Elsie said. She gathered her packages. At the door she paused, her hand on the frame. "If he leaves them in the north pasture," she said quietly, "he will not have a herd by spring." The bell above the door jingled as she stepped out into the cold. Behind her, she heard Edwin click his tongue against his teeth. That same wet sound of disapproval. She kept walking. The visitors came more frequently as winter approached, drawn by curiosity or cruelty, or some mixture of the two. Elsie learned to recognize the sound of wagons on the track, the particular creak and rattle that announced each new audience for her supposed folly. Widow Cordelia Ashford arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, her black carriage pulled by a pair of matching gray horses. She was 58 years old, the wealthiest woman in Elkhorn Creek, and she wore her disapproval like an expensive brooch. "Poor things," she said, not bothering to step down from her carriage. She surveyed the tunnel entrance, the pile of excavated rock, the goats grazing on the hillside. No parents to guide them, no proper upbringing. It is no wonder they have turned to such foolishness. Elsie stood at the entrance to her shelter, her arms folded across her chest. No invitation to enter was offered. No pleasantries were exchanged. She simply waited. "A young woman should be seeking a husband," Cordelia continued, adjusting her kid leather gloves, "not burrowing in the dirt like some kind of animal. What man would want a wife who smells of goats and limestone dust?" Elsie considered this question seriously, as if it deserved a thoughtful answer. "I suppose the kind of man I would want," she said finally, "would care more about whether his family survives the winter than whether his wife smells like flowers." Cordelia's painted lips pressed into a thin line. She clicked to her horses and drove away without another word. Deputy Marshal Silas Crenshaw came the following Thursday. He was a tall man with a drooping mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much foolishness in his 45 years. "Just want to make sure you understand," he said, standing at the entrance to the tunnel with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "If this thing collapses, the county has no obligation to dig you out. No legal requirement whatsoever." "I understand," Elsie said. "And if you suffocate in there, I cannot be held responsible." "I understand that too." He nodded, seeming satisfied. Then he looked at the ventilation shaft, at the carefully constructed door, at the smooth walls of the entrance. "Your daddy was a miner," he said, his voice losing some of its official edge. "Yes." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He taught you this?" "Some of it. Most of it I figured out from his drawings." The deputy marshal studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. "Good luck," he said. It was the only kindness anyone from town had offered her. The young men were crueler than their elders, in the way that young men often are when they feel their certainties threatened by something they do not understand. Billy Tate was 22 years old, the son of a successful rancher, and he had never worked a day in his life that was not supervised by someone else. He arrived one afternoon with 3 of his friends, their horses prancing and snorting, their laughter carrying across the valley like the calls of carrion birds. "Hey there, cave girl," Billy shouted from atop his horse. "How are the badgers treating you?" His friends laughed. One of them made a digging motion with his hands, pantomiming a burrowing animal. Elsie was splitting wood outside the tunnel entrance. Her attention remained fixed on the log in front of her. "Got a bet going," Billy continued, riding closer. $5 says you give up before November's out. 5 more says you come crawling to town begging for shelter before Christmas. Elsie set another log on the splitting stump. She raised her axe. "You know what they call you in town?" Billy's voice had an edge now, frustrated by her lack of reaction. "The Badger Girl, the crazy Kincaid. Some folks say your whole family was touched in the head. Say that is why your mama drowned and your daddy got himself crushed." The axe came down. The log split clean. Elsie set the pieces aside and reached for another log. Her face showed nothing. Her hands were steady. Billy opened his mouth to say something else, but one of his friends tugged at his sleeve. "Come on," he muttered. "She is not worth it. Let her freeze." They rode away, their laughter fading into the distance. Toby emerged from the tunnel, his face flushed with anger. "Why did you not say anything? Why did you let them talk about Mom and Papa like that?" Elsie split another log before answering. "Because words are just air," she said. "They wanted me to react, wanted me to give them something they could use against me. I gave them nothing. But they said, I know what they said." She set down the axe and looked at her brother. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. He was 15, old enough to understand cruelty, but young enough to still be wounded by it. "Papa used to tell me about the tin miners in Cornwall," Elsie said. "How the other villages would mock them for crawling into holes in the cliff. Called them moles, called them worms. Said they were not real men because they worked in the dark." She picked up the axe again. "Those miners survived storms that washed whole villages into the sea. Their families had food when everyone else was starving, and when the other villagers came begging for shelter, the miners let them in. Because being right is its own answer, and silence makes fools reveal themselves." Toby wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Do you really think it will be that bad? The winter?" Elsie looked at the sky. It was that peculiar purple-gray, heavy and still, that she had learned to recognize. "I think," she said slowly, "that people who have never been truly tested do not know what they do not know. And I think this winter will be a test." But not everyone in Elkhorn Creek was blind to what Elsie was building. Old Martha Briggs arrived on a crisp morning in early November, walking the 2 miles from her cabin with a canvas sack over her shoulder and a carved walking stick in her gnarled hand. She was 70 years old, her face mapped with wrinkles, her eyes the faded blue of winter sky. She stood at the entrance to the tunnel for a long time, examining the construction without speaking. Elsie waited, accustomed by now to being scrutinized. Finally, Martha nodded. "Your daddy was Cornish," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I remember the winter of '56. Martha's voice was soft, distant, reaching back across 4 decades of memory, snow up to the rooftops. Temperature so cold the trees exploded. Sounded like gunshots all through the night. Folks who stayed in their wooden houses, most of them did not make it." She turned to look at Elsie, and there was something in her eyes that Elsie had not seen from anyone else in the valley. Recognition. "The ones who survived," Martha continued, "were the ones who dug in. Root cellars, mine shafts, anywhere the earth could hold them. My own grandmother, she crawled into a cave with her 3 children and stayed there for 11 days. They came out thin and weak, but they came out alive." She held out the canvas sack. "Salt," she said, "and lamp oil. You are going to need both." Elsie took the sack. Her throat felt tight. "Thank you." Martha waved a hand dismissively. "Do not thank me. You are the one doing the smart thing. I am just an old woman who remembers what everyone else has chosen to forget." She looked at the ventilation shaft, at the careful construction of the doorframe. "Your daddy would be proud," she said. "Whatever those fools in town say, you remember that. He would be proud." She turned and began the long walk back to her cabin. Elsie watched her go, the canvas sack heavy in her hands, something warm spreading through her chest despite the cold. Klaus Bergman came 3 days later. He was the blacksmith in Elkhorn Creek, a barrel-chested German immigrant with forearms like oak branches and a beard that reached to his belt buckle. He walked around the tunnel entrance without saying much, examining the door hinges, testing the strength of the frame. He looked at the ventilation shaft in the tin lining. He studied the angle of the entrance, the way it faced away from the prevailing winds. Then he nodded once. "Gut," he said. "This is good work." He reached into his leather apron and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Hinges," he explained, pressing them into Elsie's hands. "Better than what you have. Will not rust." Elsie looked at the hinges. They were beautifully made, strong and smooth, clearly worth more than she could afford. "I cannot pay you," she said. Klaus shook his head. "In the old country," he said slowly, his accent thick, "we built houses into the hills. My grandmother's house, it was like this. Half in the ground, warmest place in the village." He looked at her with something like respect. "You know things," he said. "Old things. Good things. These people," he gestured vaguely toward town, "they think new is always better. They forget that the old ways lasted because they worked." He turned to leave, then paused. "The sky," he said. "It has a bad color. You see it?" Elsie nodded. "I see it." "Yeah." Klaus pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. "I think maybe this winter, the old ways will matter again." On the last day of November, Reverend Josiah Whitmore made the journey to Quarry Ridge. He was 65 years old with a shock of white hair and kind eyes that had witnessed 6 decades of human triumph and folly. He found Elsie and Toby stacking the last of their firewood inside the tunnel entrance, where it would stay dry and accessible no matter how deep the snow piled outside. "May I see inside?" he asked. Elsie led him through the heavy oak door into the long room carved from livingstone. The goats looked up from their bedding, curious but unalarmed. Bramble thumped his tail against the ground but did not rise from his spot next to Midnight. Reverend Whitmore stood in the center of the space, turning slowly, taking it all in. The smooth walls, the arched ceiling, the neat stacks of supplies, the warmth. Outside, the November wind was bitter, cutting through the heaviest coat. Inside, the air was still and mild. "Remarkable," he said quietly. He walked to the thermometer on the support beam. 54 degrees. It stays that warm, even without a fire? "The earth holds it," Elsie explained, "and the goats add to it. Each one generates heat just by being alive. 12 goats, that is like having a small stove running all the time." The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. "Some folks in town," he said finally, "they say this is unchristian, burrowing in the ground like an animal." Elsie felt a flicker of the old defensiveness, but she pushed it down. "And what do you say, Reverend?" Whitmore smiled. He reached out and rested a hand on one of the cedar support beams. "I say that Noah built an ark when everyone laughed at him. I say that the Israelites sheltered in caves when Pharaoh's army pursued them. I say that our Lord himself was born in a stable and laid in a manger." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were warm. "God does not care what shape your shelter takes, Miss Kincaid. He cares whether you use the wisdom he gave you to protect the people you love." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Candles," he said, "for light when the lamp oil runs low, and my prayers, for whatever those are worth." Elsie took the pouch. Her eyes were stinging, and she blinked rapidly. "Thank you," she managed. Reverend Whitmore patted her shoulder. "You take care of that brother of yours," he said, "and those goats, and that fine dog." He looked around the shelter one more time, nodding slowly. "I have a feeling," he said, "that before this winter is over, a great many people are going to owe you an apology." December came with a stillness that felt like the whole world holding its breath. The temperature dropped steadily, freezing the creek, silencing the birds, turning the grass to brittle straw. But the snow held off, and the people of Elkhorn Creek began to relax. Perhaps the winter would be mild after all. Perhaps the heavy sky was just bluffing. Elsie knew better. She watched the animals. The goats were restless, pacing the shelter, their ears pricked forward as if listening for something humans could not hear. Bramble whined in his sleep, chasing something in his dreams. The squirrels had vanished from the trees, buried deep in their stores, and the birds had fled south weeks earlier than usual. Animals always knew before humans did. She brought the last of the supplies inside. She checked the ventilation shaft one final time, clearing a small drift of leaves that had accumulated. She made sure the door hinges, The beautiful copper hinges Klaus had given her were well oiled, that the heavy oak planks would swing freely even if ice tried to freeze them shut. On the morning of December 22nd, 1895, she woke to a world that had changed. The sky was no longer purple-gray, it was green, a sickly yellow-green, the color of a bruise at its worst, hanging so low it seemed to press against the hilltops. The air had a smell to it, metallic and sharp, like the taste of blood in the back of your throat. It was the smell of a storm that had traveled 1,000 miles without hitting a mountain to break it. Elsie stood at the entrance to the shelter. Bramble pressed against her leg and watched the western horizon. "Get the goats inside," she said quietly. "Toby now. All of them." Toby did not argue. He had learned to trust his sister's instincts. It took them an hour to round up the herd and secure them in the shelter. By the time the last goat was through the door, the wind had begun to rise. Not a gentle breeze, but a building pressure, a wall of air pushing against everything in its path. Elsie barred the door. The world went white. "Here is where I need to stop and ask you something. 12 goats, a hole in a hill, a door made from the wood of a cabin that the bank took away. That is all that stands between Elsie, Toby, and what is coming. Do you think it will be enough? What do you think happens next? I would love to hear your predictions in the comments." The blizzard of December 1895 did not arrive like the storms in storybooks. There was no gradual buildup, no gentle flakes drifting down from a darkening sky. It came like an assault, a physical attack on everything that lived and breathed in the Quarry Ridge Valley. The temperature plummeted 25 degrees in a single hour. The drop was so sudden and so severe that it cracked tree limbs like rifle shots, the frozen sap exploding inside the wood. Water troughs that had been liquid at dawn were solid ice by mid-morning, frozen so fast that the cattle standing beside them had not even finished drinking. Then the white wall hit. It was not snow falling. It was snow flying, driven horizontal by winds that screamed across the open plains at 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to zero in an instant. A man could not see his own boots. He could not see his hand in front of his face. The world simply ceased to exist beyond a swirling, shrieking wall of white. Inside the shelter, Elsie heard the storm arrive. She had just brought the last armful of firewood through the door, stacking it on the small pile they kept inside for emergencies. Toby was checking the goats, making sure each one had water and that the bedding was thick enough. Bramble was curled on his usual spot, a wool blanket spread beneath him. The sound changed the moment Elsie latched the heavy oak door. Outside, the wind had become something else entirely, a howling fury that clawed at the hillside with fingers of ice and rage, searching for any weakness, any crack, any way inside. The noise was tremendous, terrifying, the voice of something ancient and hungry that wanted to tear apart everything in its path. Inside, the sound was muffled to a dull, rhythmic thrumming, like being in the belly of a great ship. The thick earthen walls absorbed the violence, transforming it into a low, almost soothing pulse. Elsie lit the lantern and hung it on its hook. The flame burned straight and steady, not even a flicker disturbing its glow. In a wooden house, that flame would be dancing and guttering, bent by drafts that found every crack and gap in the construction. Here, under 6 feet of earth and limestone, the air was still. She looked at the thermometer. 60 degrees. The goats were calm, huddled together in the straw, chewing their cud as if this were any other evening. Midnight lay in the center of the group, her black coat standing out against the lighter colors of the other animals. Bramble had moved to lie beside her, and the big goat seemed to accept this arrangement without complaint. Toby sat on his cot, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes wide. "Is it always like this?" he asked. His voice was small, almost lost beneath the muffled roar. Elsie shook her head. "No, this is different." She made herself a cup of tea on the small spirit lamp, wrapping her hands around the tin mug to absorb its warmth. Not because she was cold. The shelter was comfortable, pleasant even, but the ritual was soothing, a small act of normalcy in the face of the violence churning just feet above their heads. She thought about the town, 4 miles away. She thought about the drafty windows in the general store, the gaps in the barn siding where wind would whistle through like knives. She thought about the boarding house with its thin walls and its single stove, trying to heat rooms that leaked warmth faster than the fire could produce it. She thought about Garrett Holloway's cattle, 50 head of them standing in the north pasture, with nothing but their thick coats to protect them. No satisfaction rose in her chest, only a deep, aching sadness. They did not have to be out there, she said quietly. Toby looked up. What? The cattle, the people, none of them had to be exposed to this. They chose it. They chose to trust in what had always worked before because it was easier than admitting they might be wrong. She sipped her tea. Papa used to say that pride was the most expensive thing a man could own, because the price of pride was always paid by someone else. The hours stretched into a shapeless darkness of waiting. Elsie slept in shifts, waking every 4 hours to check the ventilation shaft. The routine was simple but critical. She would wrap her face in a wool scarf, climb the small ladder built into the wall, and use a long pole to punch through any snow that had accumulated at the top of the chimney. Each time she broke through the drift, the shriek of the wind would invade the silence for a few terrifying seconds, a reminder of the violence churning just above their heads. Snow would spray down onto her face, so cold it felt like a burn. Then she would pack the baffle shut again, and the quiet would return. The goats generated a moist, living heat that soaked into the clay walls. The earth banked that warmth and radiated it back, a continuous cycle of exchange between animal and stone. It was a symbiosis that her father had understood instinctively, knowledge passed down through generations of Cornish miners who had learned to survive in the deep places of the world. By the second day, the world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the whiteout and the cold. Elsie calculated the exterior temperature based on how far the frost crept around the doorframe, the way the ice crystals formed on the small gap beneath the threshold. Her estimate was 30 degrees below zero, perhaps colder. Inside, she took off her heavy shawl. The goats were restless now, butting heads and bleating softly, bored and hungry for fresh forage. But Elsie fed them from the stack of dried willow, and they settled, accepting this substitute for the grass they preferred. The shelter was cramped. The smell was pungent. Goat musk and lamp oil and human sweat. All of it concentrated in a space with limited ventilation. But it was alive. The air moved, the animals breathed, and the temperature held steady at 55 degrees while the world outside tried to kill everything in it. Then on the evening of the second day, Elsie heard something that was not the wind. It was a thud, dull and heavy, against the door. Then a scratching. The rhythm was too frantic, too desperate for an animal. A wolf or a deer would have moved differently, would have made different sounds. This was something upright, something with hands. Elsie's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy iron bar they kept beside the door, the one she had fashioned from a broken wagon axle. Toby was awake now, sitting up on his cot, his eyes wide and frightened. "Who is it?" Elsie shouted. Her voice sounded small against the earthen walls, swallowed by the density of stone and soil. "Elsie." The voice was muffled, cracked, barely recognizable, but she knew it. It was Edwin Bancroft's voice, stripped of all its gossip and judgment and false concern. "For God's sake, open the door." She pulled the bar and shoved the heavy oak planks outward. The wind caught them instantly, nearly ripping the door from her grasp. A blast of ice crystals hit her face like buckshot, stinging and burning against her exposed skin. A figure fell into the room, tumbling onto the straw in a tangle of frozen limbs and ice-crusted clothing. Behind him, a second shape stumbled through, larger, more hesitant, already beginning to collapse. Elsie slammed the door shut, throwing her entire weight against it to latch the bar. Her boots slipped on the sudden influx of snow that had blown in with the men. The howling of the wind cut off abruptly, replaced by the muffled silence of the underground. On the floor lay Edwin Bancroft, his face gray and waxy with frostbite, his thin mustache frozen into brittle icicles. His eyes were wild with terror, the eyes of a man who had just looked death in the face and found it staring back. Behind him, shivering so violently that his teeth clattered like dice, was Garrett Holloway. The cattleman looked small, smaller than Elsie had ever seen him. His Stetson hat was gone, lost somewhere in the white void. His expensive coat was frozen stiff, a shell of ice that was already beginning to melt in the warmth of the goat shelter. Water dripped from him, pooling on the packed earth floor. He looked up at Elsie, He looked at the dry floor, the calm animals, the lantern light burning steady and strong. He looked at the thermometer on the support beam. His face crumpled. "The cattle," he whispered. His voice was broken, shattered like thin ice. "They are dying standing up. The barns, the wind went right through them, ripped the windows out like they were paper. The cold, it just—" He could not finish. "Drink this," Elsie said. She knelt beside them, holding out a cup of warm goat's milk she had drawn just an hour before. The steam rose from it, visible in the air, a small proof of life in a world that had been trying to end theirs. No words of recrimination passed her lips. The storm was judgment enough. "Drink," she said again. The warmth inside the hill was not like the dry, crackling heat of a stove. It was thick and humid, a weight that smelled of living things, of breath and fur, and the green scent of digested grass. With 2 grown men added to the dozen goats, the temperature began to climb steadily. The thermometer on the cedar post crept towards 65 degrees despite the howling death outside. Garrett sat with his back against the clay wall, his knees pulled to his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow as the heat began to painfully thaw his extremities. The agony of blood returning to frozen fingers was a specific, nauseating torture, and the cattleman groaned through gritted teeth, stripping off his stiff leather gloves to reveal hands that were white and waxy as tallow candles. Elsie knew that pain was the only sign the tissue was still alive. She moved among the goats, checking their hooves and murmuring to Midnight, who had positioned herself aggressively between the strangers and the rest of the herd. The animals were agitated by the intrusion, their rectangular pupils widening in the lantern light, but the sheer density of bodies in the small space created a thermal battery that no blizzard could breach. "The wind took the roof," Edwin whispered. He held the tin cup of milk with both hands, his body still shaking with residual cold. "It took the roof right off the feed store. Just peeled it back like a sardine can. We tried to make for the church, but the snow—" He trailed off, his eyes losing focus. "You cannot see your own feet, Elsie. You cannot see the ground. We would have died out there. We would have frozen solid in 50 steps if we had not seen the smoke from your chimney." Elsie looked at him. The smoke from her ventilation shaft. The small, thin column of vapor that she had worried might get blocked by drifting snow. That wisp of warmth had saved their lives. "Drink," she said for the 3rd time. "Talk later. Shivering burns calories you do not have." Garrett looked up. The arrogance that had defined him at the auction yard, that had colored every interaction she had ever had with him, was gone, stripped away and left out in the drifts along with his hat and his certainty and his pride. He looked around the earthen room, taking in the curvature of the ceiling, the dry straw, the stacked willow branches. He looked at the absolute lack of draft. He watched the flame of the lantern. It stood straight and tall, not flickering once. In his own house, a 2-story monument to his success, the curtains would be dancing right now. The heat would be sucked out through 1,000 invisible gaps in the joinery, through the window frames and the door seals, and the places where the floorboards did not quite meet the walls. Here, under 6 feet of dirt and limestone, the storm was just a rumor, a vibration in the earth, a muffled complaint from a world that had suddenly become irrelevant. "You knew," Garrett rasped. The words scraped his throat like broken glass. "How did you know it would be this bad?" Elsie adjusted the wick of the lantern, conserving the oil that would need to last an unknown number of days. "I did not know how bad," she said simply. "I just knew there would be a winter, and I knew that wood rots and wind breaks it, but the hill does not care about the wind. And these goats, they are built for the high rocks. They have thick undercoats that hold heat close to the skin. Your cattle are plains animals, Mr. Holloway. They were bred for money, not for survival. The hours bled into a shapeless duration of waiting. There was no day or night in the dugout, only the rhythm of the goats chewing their cud and the periodic need to clear the ventilation shaft. Every 4 hours, Elsie would make her climb, would punch through the accumulating drift with her long pole, would endure those few terrifying seconds when the shriek of the wind invaded their sanctuary. During one of these checks, near the end of the 2nd day with the men in the shelter, the pole snagged. Elsie pushed harder. The resistance held firm. Her heart stopped. For one terrible moment, she was certain that the drift had frozen solid, sealing them in. She imagined the air growing thick and stale, the lantern flame turning yellow and dim, the goats beginning to panic as the oxygen ran out. She shoved with all her weight, her boots slipping on the ladder rungs, her shoulders straining with effort. The ice cracked with a sound like breaking bones, and a spray of powder fell onto her face, bringing with it a draft of air so cold it felt like a physical blow. She climbed down, shaking, and found Garrett watching her. No words passed between them, but the look on his face had changed. It was no longer fear, no longer shock. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like respect. He had realized, perhaps for the first time, that his life and Edwin's life hung on the structural integrity of a hole in the ground and the stubbornness of a girl he had laughed at. By the third cycle of sleeping and waking, the air in the shelter had grown heavy and stale. The goats were restless, butting heads and bleating their complaints, their musk becoming overpowering in the confined space. Edwin had stopped shivering and fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. His face had regained some color, though the frost-bitten patches on his cheeks would leave scars that he would carry for the rest of his life. Garrett remained awake, staring at the thermometer. It had dropped slightly as the storm outside reached its zenith, the cold seeping through the very soil, but it held at 50 degrees. 50 degrees while the world above froze solid. He watched Elsie milk the goats, her hands efficient and rhythmic, filling the tin pails with warm milk that steamed in the cool air. She had little food for humans, some dried apples, a sack of flour, the milk itself. But it was enough. It was more than enough when the alternative was death. "I have 500 head," Garrett said suddenly into the gloom, "in the north pasture and the south range. Another 200 in the barn." Elsie kept milking. "Do not," she said softly. "The barn is big." Garrett's voice had a pleading quality, as if he were trying to convince the walls, trying to make the reality different by speaking a different truth. "It has a loft. It is double-walled." "It has windows," Elsie said. She poured the fresh milk into a jug, her movements precise and unhurried. "Glass transmits cold 20 times faster than wood, and wood transmits cold 50 times faster than earth. If the wind blew the roof off the feed store, Mr. Holloway, your barn windows are gone. And once the windows go—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. Garrett closed his eyes, his head leaning back against the clay wall. He was doing the math now. The same math Elsie had done months ago. The calculations that had driven her to pick up a pickaxe and start swinging at a hillside while the whole town laughed. He was calculating the surface area of his cows, the lack of wool, the wind chill that could make 30 below feel like 60 below. He was calculating his ruin, the silence stretched between them, filled only by the crunch of the goats eating their willow branches. "I called this a grave," Garrett whispered. "I told the boys at the saloon you were digging a grave, that you would bury yourself and your brother in it before spring." Elsie handed him a piece of hardtack biscuit that she had warmed on the spirit lamp. The food was simple, barely palatable, but it was sustenance. "You were right," she said. "It is a grave, but it is for the storm, not for us. The storm comes here to die. We just wait it out." The concept seemed to settle into him slowly, like water soaking into dry earth. He took the biscuit, his hand trembling slightly. Not from cold this time, from something else, from a humility that he had never had occasion to feel before. He looked at the goats, the small, scraggly animals he had deemed worthless. They were calm, they were warm, they were alive. He looked at his own boots, expensive leather now stained with salt and melting snow, useless against the power of the weather. "If we get out of this," he said, his voice low, "I am going to owe you more than a debt, Elsie. I am going to owe you an apology that the whole town hears." "Let us just worry about the air," Elsie replied. She was looking at the lantern flame. It was burning a little lower, a little yellower. The oxygen was thinning. The snow is drifting deeper. If the chimney blocks completely, we have about 3 hours before the air runs out. We need to conserve breath. Stop talking. Sleep. I want to pause here and share something with you. Inside that shelter, beneath 6 feet of earth and stone, 4 lives hung in the balance. 2 men who had mocked and dismissed Elsie for months. 2 children who had lost everything except each other. and 12 goats who asked for nothing but willow branches and a warm place to sleep. The storm raged outside with the fury of something that wanted to destroy everything it touched. But inside that limestone burrow, there was warmth, there was breath, there was life. What do you think happens when the storm finally ends? Let me know in the comments. The silence that woke them was louder than the wind had been. It was a profound, ringing stillness that pressed against the ears, an absence so complete that it felt like a physical presence. The vibration in the floor was gone. The muffled roar that had become the background noise of their existence had simply ceased. Elsie sat up instantly, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked at the ventilation shaft. A single beam of brilliant, blinding light was piercing through a small gap in the baffle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. It was sunlight, pure, clean sunlight, the first they had seen in 4 days. "It is over," she whispered. Getting out was harder than getting in. The snow had drifted 6 feet deep against the hillside, burying the door completely. They had to take turns digging from the inside, Elsie and Garrett working shoulder to shoulder with a shovel and a spare board, packing the excavated snow behind them into the shelter until they could carve a tunnel upward through the drift. It took 2 hours of sweating, grunting labor, the air in the shelter turning foul with their exertion, before Garrett broke through the surface crust. He pushed his way out and gasped, pulling Elsie up after him. They stood on top of the drift, blinking in the fierce glare of the sun on a world that had been completely erased. The valley was gone. The fences were gone. The road was a smooth white undulation, invisible beneath a blanket that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The only things breaking the surface were the tops of the tallest pine trees and the chimneys of houses in the distance. Thin black fingers pointing at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was crystal clear and bitterly cold, probably 20 below, but the wind was dead. The monster that had raged for 4 days had simply exhausted itself and vanished, leaving behind a silence so profound that Elsie could hear her own heartbeat. Garrett turned slowly, looking toward his ranch to the north. He stood there for a long time. There was no smoke rising from where his bunkhouse should be. There was no dark mass of the herd against the snow. There was no movement at all, just white, endless, indifferent white. His shoulders slumped, his knees buckled. He dropped into the powder, a broken man kneeling in the wreckage of everything he had built. Elsie did not look at the ranch. She looked at the ventilation chimney of her shelter, sticking up from the snow like a stubborn finger. Thin wisps of vapor rising from it into the frozen air. She looked down the hole they had dug, where Toby's face was peering up, pale and anxious. "Bring them up," she said, "one by one. The crust is hard enough to hold them if they move slow." The goats emerged from the tunnel like soldiers from a bunker, blinking and shaking their heads at the blinding brightness. Their breath plumed in the icy air, small clouds of life in a landscape that seemed to have forgotten what living things looked like. Midnight was the first out, her black coat stark against the white. She tested the snow with one sharp hoof, found it solid, and began to walk. The others followed, a single-file parade of shaggy fur and steam, their hooves finding purchase on the frozen crust where a horse would have floundered and broken through. They were hungry. They could smell the pine needles of the treetops that were now at ground level, the tips of trees that had been 30 feet tall before the snow buried their trunks. Bramble emerged last, shaking snow from his fur, his tail wagging despite everything. He looked around at the transformed world, seemed to accept it with the equanimity of a dog who trusts his people, and trotted over to walk beside Elsie. "We have to go to town," Edwin said. He had climbed out after the goats, and he stood shielding his eyes against the glare. "My wife, the store. I have to." "We will go," Elsie said. She grabbed the lead rope of Midnight. "And we are taking the herd. They have the milk. And right now, milk is the only warm thing in this valley." The town of Elkhorn Creek was a graveyard, not of bodies, not yet, but of the structures that people had trusted to keep them alive. The feed store roof was gone, scattered across the county in pieces that would not be found until spring. The church steeple had snapped like a dry twig. Barns had collapsed under the weight of snow that no one had designed them to bear. Windows were shattered, doors were blown in, and everywhere there was the peculiar silence of a place that had been beaten into submission. But the worst part was not the destruction. The worst part was the quiet. No chimneys were smoking. The coal piles were buried under 6 feet of snow, inaccessible without hours of digging. The woodsheds were the same. People were huddled in their broken houses, burning furniture and floorboards, rationing the last of their body heat. Elsie, Garrett, and Edwin walked down the center of what had been Main Street, the goats following in a single-file line, stepping high through the drifts. The sound of the goat bells was the only music in the desolate morning, a cheerful tinkling that seemed almost obscene against the devastation. Toby walked beside Bramble, one hand resting on the dog's back for comfort. His face was pale, his eyes wide, taking in the destruction with the horrified fascination of youth. They reached the town hall, a brick building that had fared better than the wooden structures around it. The windows were broken, but the walls still stood. The doors were drifted shut, packed with snow that had blown in through every gap. "Hello," Garrett shouted, his voice cracked, still weak from the ordeal. "Is anyone alive in there?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then a face appeared at one of the broken windows. It was the sheriff, a heavy man with a thick beard now matted with frost. His face was wrapped in what looked like a curtain, a makeshift scarf against the cold. "Garrett?" The sheriff's voice was hoarse with disbelief. "We thought you were dead. We thought everyone out on the ridges was dead. How in God's name did you—" He trailed off as he saw the goats, as he saw Elsie standing at the front of the little parade, her hand on midnight's rope, her face calm and steady. "I would be dead," Garrett said. His voice carried across the frozen street, strong enough for everyone inside to hear, if not for this girl in her hole in the ground. They spent the next 6 hours digging out the entrance to the town hall. Inside, they found half the population of Elkhorn Creek, 40 souls huddled together, wrapped in carpets and tapestries stripped from the walls. They were blue-lipped and shivering, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The coal stove had run dry 18 hours ago. There was no food. The pantry was in the basement, which had flooded with meltwater and then frozen into a solid block of ice. Children clung to their mothers, too cold even to cry. Old men sat with their backs against the walls, their eyes closed, conserving what little energy they had left. A woman in the corner was praying in a low, continuous murmur, the words running together into a single sound of desperate hope. Among the huddled figures, Elsie recognized Billy Tate, the young man who had bet $5 on her failure, who had called her the Badger Girl and the Crazy Kincaid, was sitting against the wall with his arm wrapped in bloody rags. His face was pale, his bravado stripped away by frostbite and fear. He looked up as Elsie approached. "I lost 3 fingers," he said quietly. His voice cracked. "Tried to ride to my father's ranch. Horse threw me half a mile out. Crawled back." Elsie knelt beside him and held out a cup of warm milk. "Drink," she said. "I called you crazy." Billy's eyes were wet. "I bet money you would die." "I know." Elsie pressed the cup into his remaining good hand. "Drink anyway." He drank. The tears ran down his frost-bitten cheeks, freezing before they reached his chin. When Elsie led the 12 goats through the front doors of the town hall, the reaction was not laughter. There were no sneers, no jokes about badgers or graves. There was only the collective, desperate gasp of people seeing salvation walk through the door on 4 cloven hooves. Elsie led Midnight to the center of the room, near the coal stove, and knelt down. She placed the milking pail beneath the goat, positioned her hands, and began to draw. The sound of milk hitting the pail was loud in the quiet room. It was a sound of life, of nourishment, of warmth that was more than physical. "Line up the children first," Elsie said. Her voice cut through the stupor like a blade through fog. "Then the old folks. Garrett, bring in the rest of the herd. Their bodies will heat this room up faster than that stove ever did." Garrett Holloway, the cattle baron, who had lost an empire in a single night, nodded like a stable boy. He turned and began herding the goats in, packing them tight around the huddled families. The smell of the animals, once a source of mockery, was now the scent of survival. The goats, sensing the need of the humans around them, stood still and calm, letting the freezing children press their small hands into coarse fur, letting the shivering elderly lean against warm flanks. The temperature in the room began to rise, degree by degree, breath by breath. Widow Cordelia Ashford, the woman who had called Elsie foolish, who had questioned what man would want a wife who smelled of goats, pushed through the crowd. Her expensive dress was torn and dirty. Her carefully arranged hair had come loose, hanging in gray tangles around her face. She dropped to her knees beside Elsie. "I am sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the words. "I am so sorry, child. I was wrong. We were all so wrong." Elsie looked at her for a long moment. The old woman's face was streaked with tears that were freezing on her cheeks. "Take the milk," Elsie said gently. "Give it to the children. That is what matters now. Can we stop for just a moment? Because I want you to really see this. A room full of people who had spent months laughing at a girl for digging a hole and buying goats. A room full of people who had called her crazy, foolish, unchristian. And now those same people were alive because of that hole and those goats. The proudest rancher in the valley was herding animals he had called scavengers. The richest woman in town was on her knees, apologizing to an 18-year-old orphan. Sometimes life has a way of teaching lessons that no teacher could ever deliver. What do you think should happen next? I would love to hear your thoughts. The spring of 1896 was the wettest on record. The snow melted in great rushing floods that swelled the creeks and turned the valley floor into a temporary lake. And as the white blanket retreated, it revealed what the blizzard had really cost. 2,700 head of cattle lay dead across the Quarry Ridge Valley. They had frozen standing up, their bodies preserved by the cold. Statues of failed husbandry scattered across the range. When the thaw came, the wolves and the crows descended, and the valley filled with the sounds and smells of nature, reclaiming what humans had tried to hold. Garrett Holloway lost everything, not just cattle. He lost barns that had collapsed under the snow. He lost horses that had broken through ice-crusted drifts and snapped their legs. He lost feed stores that had been buried and rotted. He lost the bunkhouse where 3 of his ranch hands had sheltered, trusting in walls that the wind had torn apart. Those 3 men survived, but barely. They spent 5 days burning furniture and floorboards, eating raw flour mixed with snow, before a rescue party could reach them. Garrett himself was a changed man. The Stetson hat that had been his crown was never replaced. He wore a plain wool cap now, practical and unassuming. The expensive boots that had been so useless in the snow were traded for sturdy work shoes. The arrogance that had defined him for 30 years had been frozen out of him, left behind in the drifts along with his fortune. He came to Elsie's Hill on a morning in late March, driving a wagon pulled by 2 mules. They were rented mules. He could not afford to buy any more. Elsie was in the garden she had started cutting into the south-facing slope, turning the soil that the snowmelt had softened. The goats grazed on the hillside behind her, their herd now grown by 14 new kids born in late March. 26 goats where there had been 12. Bramble lay in the warm spring sunshine, his muzzle showing the first hints of gray, but his eyes still bright, watching his person work. "Morning, Elsie," Garrett said. He climbed down from the wagon and took off his plain cap, holding it in his hands. "Mr. Holloway." He looked at the hillside where the entrance to the shelter was now framed with carefully fitted stone, wildflowers beginning to bloom around its edges. He looked at the goats, thriving on the steep, rocky ground that cattle had never been able to use. He looked at the young woman who had been so thoroughly dismissed by everyone in the valley, himself included. "Town council had a meeting last night," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the confidence that had once made it carry across auction yards and saloon floors. "We are looking to build a community storm cellar, a big one, something that can hold the whole school if it happens again." He paused, turning his cap over and over in his work-roughened hands. "We do not know how to do the ventilation. We do not know how to judge the soil depth so it does not collapse. We do not know how to make it stay warm without burning fuel we might not have." He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that Elsie had never expected to see. Humility. "We were hoping," he said, "we were hoping you could come down and supervise the dig." Elsie leaned on her spade. She looked at the town in the distance, where she could see the distinct mounds of earth rising in backyards across the valley. New root cellars, new dugouts. The architecture of pride had been replaced by the architecture of survival. They were not building up anymore. They were digging in. I can come down Tuesday, Elsie said, but you will need cedar posts. Pine rots too fast underground. We will get cedar, Garrett promised. Whatever you say, Elsie. Klaus Bergman was waiting at the construction site when Elsie arrived on Tuesday morning. The German blacksmith had volunteered to forge all the hardware for the community shelter, hinges and brackets and ventilation caps, refusing any payment. In the old country, he said, watching Elsie inspect the excavation, we have a word. Gemeinschaft. It means community, but more than that. It means people who survive together. He handed her a set of copper hinges, beautifully crafted, stronger than anything the general store could supply. These will last 100 years, he said, like the knowledge you are sharing. Elsie took the hinges and felt their weight in her hands. Thank you, Klaus. No, he shook his head. Thank you for reminding us that the old ways still matter. Garrett climbed back onto his wagon. Before he flicked the reins, he paused, looking at the goats grazing on the steep, rocky slope that no plow could break. They were eating thistles and scrub brush, thriving on the land that cattle had died on. They are not scavengers, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. They are survivors. They are just built for the weather, Elsie replied. She turned back to her garden. And they do not have too much pride to hide when the wind blows. Garrett drove away, leaving Elsie on her hill. Her attention had already returned to the earth. The community shelter was completed by October of 1896. They called it the Caleb Kincaid Memorial Shelter, though Elsie had not asked for the honor. The town council had voted on it unanimously, and Garrett Holloway himself had carved the name into the stone lintel above the entrance. It was built into the hillside at the edge of town, a great curved room that could hold 60 people in an emergency. The walls were packed clay, reinforced with stone. The ceiling was arched, supported by cedar posts 18 inches thick. There were 3 ventilation shafts, each lined with copper that would never rust. And along one wall there were pens for livestock. Goats, mostly. Half the families in Elkhorn Creek had started keeping small herds of their own, learning from Elsie how to care for the animals that had saved their lives. Deputy Marshal Silas Crenshaw stopped by the Kincaid property one afternoon in November, just as the first snow of the new winter was beginning to fall. He found Elsie splitting wood outside the shelter entrance, her movements efficient and practiced. Just wanted you to know, he said, leaning against the fence. Town council passed a new ordinance last week. Elsie set down her axe. What kind of ordinance? Building codes. Silas pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Every new structure in Elkhorn Creek has to have either a basement or a storm cellar attached, has to be inspected by someone who knows what they are looking at. He paused, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth beneath his drooping mustache. They asked me to ask you if you would be willing to do the inspections. Paid position, $10 a month. Elsie unfolded the paper and read it slowly. The words swam before her eyes, not because she could not understand them, but because she was seeing something beyond them. She was seeing the future. A future where what her father had taught her, what she had almost died to prove, would become part of the permanent foundation of this community. I would be willing, she said. Good. Silas tipped his hat. I always knew you were not crazy, Miss Kincaid. I just did not know how to say it without making the other men uncomfortable. He walked back to his horse and rode away toward town. Elsie stood for a long time, holding the paper in her hands, watching the snowflakes drift down from a sky that no longer seemed threatening. Behind her, she could hear the goats bleating softly in the shelter, could hear Toby talking to them in the low, soothing voice he had developed over the past year. Bramble came to stand beside her, pressing his warm weight against her leg. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around the old dog, burying her face in his fur. We did it, boy, she whispered. We did it. The winter of 1899 brought another test. The storm was not as severe as the blizzard of '95, but it was bad enough. Temperatures dropped to 30 below. Snow fell for 6 days straight. The wind howled across the valley with a fury that would have been deadly 4 years earlier. But this time, things were different. The community shelter held 47 people for 3 days, including the entire enrollment of the Elkhorn Creek Schoolhouse. The children treated it as an adventure, playing with the goats that had been brought in for warmth, drinking warm milk, and listening to stories told by the adults who huddled together against the cold. Not a single person died in Elkhorn Creek that winter. Across the valley, in towns that had not built shelters, the story was different. But the word spread. The word always spreads. And by the spring of 1900, delegations were coming from as far as Helena to learn about the Kincaid shelter design. Elsie taught them all. She drew diagrams and explained ventilation. She showed them how to judge soil composition and calculate load-bearing requirements. She taught them about the thermal properties of earth, about the way goats could serve as living furnaces, about the importance of storing food and water and fuel in places that could not be reached by wind or buried by snow. She never charged for the knowledge. Her father had given it to her freely, and she believed it should be passed on the same way. But she charged for the inspections and for the consulting work that seemed to grow every year. By 1902, she was the wealthiest woman in Quarry Ridge Valley, though you would never know it from looking at her. She still wore practical clothes. She still worked her garden with her own hands. She still lived in the same hillside shelter that she had dug as an 18-year-old orphan. She never married. It was not that she was opposed to the idea. Several men had come calling over the years, drawn by her reputation, her quiet strength, her uncommon wisdom. But none of them felt right. None of them understood the silence the way she did. None of them could sit with her on a winter evening, watching the snow fall, without feeling the need to fill the quiet with meaningless words. "Maybe the right person will come along," Toby said one evening when he was 25 and running the largest goat operation in 3 counties. "Or maybe they will not. Either way, you have a family, Elsie. You have me. You have the goats. You have half the valley owing you their lives." Elsie smiled. Toby had grown into a fine man, thoughtful and capable, with their father's skill with animals and their mother's gift for making people feel at ease. "I have what I need," she said. "I always did. I just did not know it until the storm came." Widow Cordelia Ashford died in the spring of 1902, leaving behind a will that surprised everyone in Elkhorn Creek. She had bequeathed her entire estate, some $12,000 and a Victorian house on Main Street, to the Elkhorn Creek Emergency Fund. A separate clause directed that $1,000 be given to Elspeth Kincaid personally, with a letter attached. The letter was brief. "Miss Kincaid, I spent 60 years believing that propriety mattered more than wisdom, and that a woman's place was determined by her dress and her manners, rather than her knowledge and her courage. You proved me wrong. Use this money however you see fit. I trust your judgment more than I ever trusted my own. With profound respect, Cordelia Ashford." Elsie used the money to buy goats for 3 families who could not afford them, and to fund scholarships for young women who wanted to study engineering. Garrett Holloway died in the autumn of 1904, peacefully in his sleep, in the small cabin he had built after losing his ranch. He had never rebuilt his fortune. He had never tried. Something in him had changed during those 4 days in the shelter, some fundamental understanding of what mattered and what did not. In his will, he left his remaining 20 acres to the Elkhorn Creek Community Trust, with specific instructions that it be used to expand the memorial shelter that bore Caleb Kincaid's name. He also left a letter for Elsie. She read it alone, sitting on the hillside where her father's grave marker stood, the stone weathered now by a decade of Montana seasons. Bramble lay beside her, old and stiff, but still loyal, still present. The letter said, "Miss Kincaid, I have thought many times about what to say to you, and I have never found the right words. But now that I am near the end, I think perhaps the words do not matter as much as the truth behind them. I was a proud man. I built an empire on pride, and I lost it the same way. But in those 4 days in your shelter, in that hole in the ground that I had called a grave, I learned something that my pride had never let me see. The earth does not care about our pride. The wind does not care about our accomplishments. The cold does not care about our plans. But people can care about each other. And that is the only thing that matters when the storm comes. You saved my life, not just by letting me into your shelter, but by showing me that everything I thought I knew was wrong. That is a hard gift to receive, but it is a gift nonetheless. I hope you have a long and happy life, Miss Kincaid. I hope you have children who carry your wisdom forward. I hope the world is kind to you in ways that it was not kind to your parents. And I hope that when your time comes, many years from now, you die knowing that you made a difference, that the things you built will outlast you, that the knowledge you preserved will save lives you will never know. That is the only immortality any of us can hope for. With respect and gratitude, Garrett Holloway Elsie folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She sat for a long time, her hand resting on Bramble's head, watching the sun set over the valley she had grown to love. The hills were dotted with structures now, shelters, root cellars, half-buried homes that looked strange to visitors, but made perfect sense to anyone who had survived a Montana winter. The architecture of survival had become the architecture of daily life. She had done that. She and Toby and a dozen goats and a loyal dog, and the memory of a father who had known things that other people had forgotten. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. The wind carried her words away, out across the valley, toward wherever such words go when they are spoken to the dead. In the spring of 1906, old Martha Briggs passed away at the age of 81. She had been the first person in Elkhorn Creek to validate Elsie's choices, the first to bring supplies and kindness when everyone else brought mockery. The whole town turned out for her funeral. Elsie stood at the graveside, her hand resting on Toby's arm, watching as the woman who had remembered the winter of 1856 was lowered into the earth she had trusted to protect her. After the service, Reverend Whitmore, now 76 and moving slowly, made his way to where Elsie stood. "She told me once," the old preacher said, "that she knew you would prove everyone wrong, that she could see your father in you, the stubbornness, the quiet certainty, the willingness to trust what you knew, even when everyone else was shouting that you were crazy." Elsie nodded. She was kind to us when kindness was rare. Reverend Whitmore patted her hand. "You have been kind in return, to everyone, even the people who did not deserve it." He looked out at the valley, at the green hills and the scattered buildings, at the community that had grown up around the principles Elsie had demonstrated. "That is the real legacy," he said. "Not the shelters, not the goats, not the techniques. The real legacy is mercy, the way you welcomed in the very men who had laughed at you, the way you never demanded apologies or rubbed their faces in their mistakes." His old eyes were bright with something like wonder. "That is what your father really taught you, Miss Kincaid. Not just how to survive the storm, but how to remain human while you are doing it." Bramble died that summer on a warm July evening, with his head resting on Elsie's lap. He had been slowing down for months, his once energetic trot reduced to a careful walk, his sharp eyes going cloudy with age. But he still followed Elsie everywhere. He still slept at the foot of her bed. He still watched over the goats with the patient dedication of a dog who knew his purpose. On his last day, he walked out to his favorite spot on the hillside, the place where he used to sit and watch Elsie dig. He lay down in the grass, and Elsie lay down beside him, and they watched the sun set together the way they had 1,000 times before. When the light was nearly gone, Bramble lifted his head and licked her face. Then he put his head back down, let out a long sigh, and was still. Elsie buried him next to her father's marker, in a grave she dug with her own hands. The headstone she commissioned was small and simple. "Bramble, a faithful friend who knew that home is not a place, but the people you love." Toby found her there the next morning, sitting beside the fresh grave, her eyes dry but distant. "He was a good dog," Toby said softly. "He was the best," Elsie replied. "Papa knew. Papa always knew." Midnight outlived Bramble by 4 years. The black goat had been the first one Elsie chose at that auction, the one with the intelligent eyes and the calm demeanor. She had borne 37 kids over her lifetime, and her descendants made up half the goat population in the valley by the time she finally lay down in the warm straw of the shelter and did not get up again. Toby found her there on a November morning, peaceful and still, her eyes closed as if she were only sleeping. "She was a good goat," Elsie said, standing beside her brother in the shelter where it had all begun. "She kept us warm when warmth was the difference between life and death." They buried Midnight on the hillside, near the ventilation shaft she used to sleep beside, where the warm air rising from below would keep the grass green even in winter. I need to stop here and tell you something. This is not just a story about surviving a storm. This is a story about what we pass on to the people who come after us. Caleb Kincaid passed his knowledge to his daughter. Elsie passed it to her brother, to her neighbors, to anyone who would listen. Old Martha Briggs passed on her memory of harder times. Even Garrett Holloway, in his own way, passed on a lesson about the cost of pride. We are all links in a chain that stretches back further than we can see and forward further than we can imagine. The question is not whether we will be part of that chain. The question is what we will add to it. What do you want your legacy to be? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Elspeth Kincaid lived to be 83 years old. She saw the new century arrive. She saw automobiles replace horses on the streets of Elkhorn Creek. She saw telephones and electric lights and 100 other wonders that her father could never have imagined. But she never left her hillside. She expanded the shelter over the years, adding rooms and storage and a proper kitchen dug into the earth. She installed glass windows that let in light without letting in cold. She built a greenhouse against the southern slope, where she grew vegetables through the winter, heated by the same geothermal principles that kept her living quarters warm. The town grew up around her. What had once been a 4-mile walk to Elkhorn Creek became a 15-minute stroll to the edge of a thriving community. The Caleb Kincaid Memorial Shelter was expanded twice, and then a second shelter was built, and then a third. By 1920, every public building in Elkhorn Creek had an underground component. The school, the library, the town hall, all of them had basements designed according to principles that Elsie had learned from her father and tested in the crucible of the worst blizzard in living memory. Toby married a school teacher named Margaret, a practical woman who loved goats and understood silence. They had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and Elsie taught all of them the old ways. How to read the sky, how to judge the quality of soil, how to build things that would last. The youngest, a girl named Rosemary, after the grandmother she had never known, showed the most aptitude. By the time she was 15, she was designing improvements to the shelter systems that her aunt had never considered. By 20, she was studying engineering at the State University, writing her thesis on traditional building techniques and their modern applications. She would go on to design emergency shelters for the Works Progress Administration during the Depression, structures that saved thousands of lives during the dust storms that ravaged the Great Plains. She always credited her Aunt Elsie. Elsie died on a winter evening in 1951, with Toby holding her hand. She had been failing for weeks, her strong body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of 83 years. But her mind remained sharp until the end, and her last words were characteristically practical. "The winter wheat," she murmured. "Toby, make sure Margaret knows about the winter wheat, the variety I planted in the lower field. It is resistant to the early frost. Do not let them forget." "We will not forget," Toby promised. Elsie smiled. Her eyes, still the color of Montana sky, drifted toward the window, toward the hillside where she had dug her first shelter 63 years before. "I can see Papa," she said quietly, "and Mama, and Bramble." Her eyes closed. She did not open them again. They buried her beside her parents and her faithful dog in a small cemetery on the hillside that had become known throughout 3 states as Kincaid's Ridge. The headstone was carved from local limestone, the same stone she had dug through to build her shelter. The funeral was the largest Elkhorn Creek had ever seen. People came from as far as California and New York, engineers and architects and historians who wanted to pay respects to the woman whose work had influenced a generation of emergency preparedness thinking. Garrett Holloway's grandson gave one of the eulogies. He spoke about how his grandfather had spent the last decade of his life telling anyone who would listen about the young woman who had saved his life by trusting knowledge that everyone else had dismissed. "She was not just a survivor," he said, standing before the assembled crowd. "She was a teacher. She taught us that the old ways are not old because they are outdated. They are old because they have been tested. They have been proven. They have been passed down through generations because they work." He paused, looking out at the hillside, at the entrance to the shelter that still stood exactly as Elsie had built it, maintained now by Toby and his children. "And she taught us something else," he continued. "She taught us that being right is not enough. You have to be kind. You have to welcome the people who doubted you. You have to share what you know, even with the ones who laughed." His voice broke slightly. "My grandfather laughed at her. He called her crazy, and she saved his life anyway. That is the kind of person she was. That is the kind of person we should all try to be." The shelter still stands today. It has been designated a National Historic Landmark, visited by thousands of people every year who want to see where Elspeth Kincaid weathered the Great Blizzard of 1895. Historians have documented her techniques. Engineers have studied her designs. Writers have told her story in books and articles and dissertations. But the most important legacy is not in the history books. The most important legacy is in the families who still dig root cellars in their backyards, in the emergency preparedness plans that include provisions for livestock, in the building codes that require underground shelter access in communities across the Northern Plains. The most important legacy is in the question that people ask when faced with mockery for doing something unconventional. What if they are wrong and I am right? Elsie asked that question when she was 18 years old, standing in a general store in Montana, counting out coins for a pound of nails, while a thin man with a thin mustache told her she was going to suffocate in the hole she was digging. She asked it when she walked into a livestock auction and bought 12 goats that everyone else considered worthless. She asked it when she barred her door against a storm that wanted to kill everything it touched, trusting in knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Cornish miners who had learned to survive in the deep places of the earth. And she answered it with action, with persistence, with faith in what she knew, even when everyone around her was certain she was wrong. The earth holds its warmth, 50 degrees year-round if you go deep enough. The wind is what kills, not the ground. The ground wants to keep you alive. Those were Caleb Kincaid's words, spoken to his daughter by candlelight in a cabin that no longer exists. But the wisdom survives. The knowledge survives. The legacy survives. And somewhere in Montana, on a hillside that everyone once said was worthless, the entrance to a limestone burrow still opens into the earth. The walls are smooth with age. The ceiling curves in a gentle arch. The air is still and warm, 54 degrees, no matter what the weather is doing outside. A family of goats grazes on the slope above, descendants of the original 12. Their strange horizontal eyes watch the visitors who come to take photographs and pay their respects. They are not scavengers. They are survivors, just like the woman who knew that they would be. I want to thank you for staying with me through this story. Elsie Kincaid was a woman who faced a storm that killed thousands, and she survived because she trusted knowledge that everyone else had forgotten. But her real victory was not surviving. Her real victory was what she did afterward. She taught, she shared, she forgave. She built things that outlasted her. That is the kind of legacy that matters. Not the money we accumulate or the titles we earn, but the knowledge we pass on and the kindness we show to people who do not always deserve it. If this story touched you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I hope you will remember that the old ways lasted because they worked. Sometimes the wisdom of our grandparents is worth more than all the progress in the world. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. The end.